Opening scene: the doomed June morning. June 16, 1943, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The air was heavy, with tropical humidity, and the heat was building even before the sun could burn off the low coastal haze clinging to the Owen Stanley Range. Captain Jay Zeamer Jr, a man whose quiet intensity belied his years, methodically fired up the four mighty Wright Cyclone engines of his B-17E bomber. The noise, a deep, rhythmic roar, was the sound of overwhelming power, yet today, it felt like an anxious pulse. The aircraft, bearing the official identification number 41266, was far better known by its ironic, almost affectionate nickname, Old 666. It sat at the very end of the runway, loaded far beyond typical capacity with enough fuel for a grueling $10 extra round-trip flight, and enough ammunition, scavenged and carefully secured, to suggest the commencement of a small private war. The absence of escort and calculated risk. What was glaringly and terrifyingly absent was the sight of any P-38 Lightnings or P-40 Warhawks preparing to join formation. Old 666 would fly alone. Zeamer was about to pilot over 1,000 miles of hostile ocean and deep into the most heavily defended Japanese airspace in the Pacific, accompanied only by his crew of 9 hand-picked volunteers. Every man aboard was a veteran, and every man knew the stark reality. The odds of returning were infinitesimally small. Data as destiny. The urgency of Operation Cartwheel, the mission briefing, delivered hours earlier, had been grimly blunt. Allied intelligence was paralyzed by a lack of current data. They desperately needed reconnaissance photographs of Bin and Bougainville. In the northern Solomon Islands, Japanese forces were rapidly completing massive airfield complexes. They're a formidable threat. General MacArthur's forward planners needed to know exactly what defenses they were facing before they could risk launching Operation Cartwheel, the linchpin strategy designed to neutralize Rabaul. The impossibility of range and standard doctrine. The central problem was simple geography and inadequate technology. Bin sat roughly $600 x deep into enemy territory, completely surrounded by a network of airfields supporting at least 400 Japanese fighters. Standard doctrine mandated that photo reconnaissance missions receive heavy fighter escorts, but the distance was too great. No Allied fighter in the Pacific had the operational range to make the required round trip, escort the bomber over the target, and return safely. The pilot's refusal and the reality of suicide. 3 different, established bomber crews had already been offered this assignment, and all 3 had declined. The official records were diplomatically vague, declined due to tactical concerns, but the stark, unofficial reality was common knowledge in the hangar. Experienced pilots looked at the maps and, running the numbers, correctly informed their commanders. This wasn't a mission. It was a suicide run with extra steps. The exposure was total. Predictable exposure. A heavy bomber, flying alone over known enemy strongholds, was forced to maintain predictable altitudes and steady speeds, simply because the specialized photo equipment of 1943 acquired a stable platform. The Japanese lookout posts and radar would spot Old 666 from $50 ext away. They would have ample time to vector every available zero into the interception zone. There would be no cloud cover, no maneuverability, and no one to help. The appearance of the maverick engineer. It was then that someone suggested Jay Zeamer. He wasn't necessarily the pilot with the most decoration or the smoothest record, but Zeamer carried a unique reputation for volunteering for the missions nobody else wanted, and, despite all predictions, somehow always bringing his plane and crew back alive. He'd flown Old 666 on countless hazardous mapping runs over previously uncharted sections of New Guinea, constantly staying just ahead of Japanese patrols. The rescue imperative, strategic and moral duty. When headquarters offered him the Bougainville mission, Zeamer's response was immediate and focused. He studied the charts, recalculated fuel consumption based on reduced power settings, and consulted his crew. He understood the danger intimately. His profound motivator, however, lay elsewhere. 9 Allied air crews, nearly 90 men, were currently stranded in the waters and jungles around Bougainville, survivors of previous operations, hiding from Japanese patrols and waiting for rescue. Data as salvation. The reconnaissance photographs from the specific flight would be the critical piece of intelligence, providing rescue coordinators with the exact locations of enemy positions, confirming safe withdrawal routes, and identifying viable island pickup points. Those photographs could mean the difference between immediate life and certain death for nearly 100 men. The cargo in his Bombay was not destruction, it was salvation. The takeoff and the silent vow. On that grim June morning, Zeamer and his crew climbed aboard Old 666, performed their pre-flight checks with the quiet professionalism that bordered on fatalism, and rolled down the runway at Port Moresby. The control tower wished them good hunting, but nobody said, "See you later," as the bomber lifted off and turned north into the coastal haze. More than a few ground crew members silently wondered if they had just witnessed 10 men fly directly to their deaths. The unwanted pilot and the unwanted bomber. The story of Captain Zeamer's success is rooted in institutional negligence and personal refusal to be contained. This narrative is not about the military's elite. It is about a pilot nobody wanted inheriting, a bomber nobody wanted, and transforming both into a legend through sheer engineering ingenuity and stubborn refusal to accept limitations. The MIT engineer's frustration. Zeamer, an MIT engineering graduate, arrived in the Pacific in 1942. His excellent flying skills were matched only by his terrible assignment. Backup pilot, a spare, who flew mundane cargo runs. This was deeply humiliating for a man driven to combat the rebellion against protocol. Zeamer's problem, in the eyes of his rigid superiors, was his intelligence and independence. He questioned outdated tactics. He openly suggested aircraft modifications that ground crews had not requested. He spent his time studying complex Japanese fighter tactics rather than conforming. This made him a troublemaker. The final institutional judgment was damning. Lieutenant Zeamer, while competent, showed insufficient deference to established protocols. Military language for this pilot thinks he's smarter than his commanding officers. The wreckage and the vision. Then, the badly damaged Old 666 arrived. Shot up and barely salvageable, it was towed to the far end of the airfield, marked for eventual scrapping. For most, it was invisible wreckage. For Zeamer, it was a profound opportunity. The bargain and the misfit crew. He proposed a radical bargain to his commanding officer. "Let me fix it, and let me keep it. I'll form my own crew, run our own missions, and stay completely out of everyone's way." The skeptical permission was granted. Sure, whatever. Zeamer immediately recruited his crew. Joe Sarnowski, a brilliant bombardier and fellow outsider, and other gunners and operators who were all united by the shared experience of being overlooked. Creative engineering beyond regulation. Zeamer and his misfit crew rebuilt Old 666 from the frameout, turning it into a fortress that Boeing engineers never conceived. Armament upgrade. Standard B-17E carried 13 50 cal guns. Zeamer added 6 more, total 19, scavenging weapons and installing them in custom mounts to ensure interlocking fields of fire with no blind spots. Ventral defense. He installed guns firing straight down through the fuselage floor, eliminating the highly vulnerable belly area of favorite attack point for Japanese Zeros. Armor and ammunition. He added extra armor plating to the nose section, technically against safety regulations and weight limits. He modified the Bombay to carry maximum defensive ammunition instead of bombs, prioritizing defense over offense for reconnaissance. The tactical anomaly. Maintenance crews viewed him as obsessed. Other pilots mocked him, calling the heavily armed bomber the flying porcupine. But when Old 666 rolled Back onto the active flight line in May 1943 was a tactical anomaly. It was heavier and slower, but in a fight, it could output double the standard defensive firepower. Advantage from defiance. Zeamer had channeled his MIT engineering training and institutional frustration into a tangible tactical advantage. His crew had flown enough missions to prove they were reliable. The final call, when headquarters faced the grim necessity of sending someone on the impossible mission, they bypassed the regulation following pilots and chose the defiant engineer and his unique Frankenstein fortress. Deep penetration and meticulous calculation. The flight into the heart of the Japanese-held Solomons took nearly 4 grueling hours. For most of the initial journey, a tense, unnatural quiet dominated the interior of Old 666. Zeamer, the engineer pilot, was focused on meticulous conservation. He kept the engines throttled back, nursing every drop of fuel, understanding that their margin for error on the return trip was razor thin. They flew at a steady $25,000 IXT, high enough to minimize interception by patrol boats and anti-aircraft fire, yet low enough to manage the crew's oxygen needs without constant adjustment. Crew coordination and preparation. The cohesion of the misfit crew became their temporary shield. Navigator Ruby Johnston worked his charts, meticulously calling out slight course corrections based on astronomical readings and drift, constantly ensuring they were on the exact vector. Radio operator Forrest Dillman maintained absolute radio silence, but continuously monitored enemy frequencies, listening for any telltale spike in chatter that would signify Japanese radar had successfully located their position. In the nose, Bombardier Joe Sarnowski, the crucial technical expert, made final adjustments to the large format K-17 cameras, ensuring precise lens angles and correct exposure settings. The atmosphere wasn't panic. It was the controlled, internalized pressure of highly trained professionals confronting a near-certain death trap. The moment of exposure. At approximately 0900 hours, they reached the objective. Zeamer dropped the bomber to $20,000 IXT, effed and leveled out. The photo pass began. This was the period of extreme vulnerability. For the intelligence photographs to be usable, sharp, clear, and geometrically accurate, Old 666 had to fly with unwavering stability, maintaining exact altitude and speed. No evasive maneuvers, no deviation allowed. They had to hold steady while the cameras continuously captured image after image of the airfields, gun emplacements, and supply depots below. The alarm is raised. They were 3 minutes into the critical 6-minute run when waist gunner William Vaughn shattered the tense silence. Black dots were climbing fast and aggressively from the direction of Kahili Airfield. Vaughn keyed his intercom, his voice tight but controlled. Fighters 5 o'clock high. Looks like zeros, skipper. I count at least 15, maybe 20. The controlled tension vanished, replaced by sharp, immediate danger. The do-or-die decision. Zeamer's response remained eerily calm, cold core in the escalating crisis. How long until they reach us, Ruby? Johnston, running quick mental math based on the zero's climb rate, replied. 3 minutes, maybe. 4. Zeamer faced the ultimate military and moral dilemma. Break off now, run for home, and deliver incomplete data, or hold the course, finish the photographic run, and face the overwhelming enemy force head-on. Zeamer never entertained the thought of failure. His command was definitive. All guns, get ready. We're finishing this run. The moral weight of the 87 stranded airmen outweighed the immediate threat of death. The unavoidable collision. The gunners scrambled, chambering rounds and scanning the sky. The black dots grew larger rapidly, resolving into the distinctive, deadly silhouettes of Mitsubishi A6M0's pilots trained for dominance and operating over their home territory. Intelligence suggested the Japanese had over 400 fighters in the northern Solomons. They were clearly sending a substantial intercept force to welcome the lone American bomber. The unprecedented defense. The first zero attacked at, diving from above and behind the classic bomber attack angle. Tail gunner Herbert Pugh returned. Fire instantly, his twin, 50 calibers hammering out rounds at $800 IXT. The Zero broke off, but 3 more immediately followed, attacking simultaneously from multiple vectors. Against a standard B-17, this coordinated tactic would dismantle the defenses quickly. But Old 666 was different. Its 19 guns ensured that Zeros attacking from any vector ran into concentrated, interlocking fire. Attacks from the rear met the tail, both waists and the dorsal turret. Critical attacks from below were met by Zeamer's supplementary ventral gun. Material stress and Zeamer's precision. The aircraft shook violently under the impact of enemy rounds and the simultaneous, rotating recoil of its own heavy armament. Empty brass casings piled up on the floor. The heat from the continuous firing raised the internal temperature past 100 IXT. Zeamer flew the bomber not just with skill, but with the precise calculation of an engineer making micro-corrections, constantly counteracting the buffeting, never enough to ruin the photo run, but just enough to disrupt the enemy's aim by critical fractions of a degree. Through the storm of fire, the cameras continued their steady, silent work. The breaching of the cockpit. The Zeros kept coming, wave after wave, determined to break the stable platform. Catastrophe struck the flight deck. A $20 IXT cannon shell punched through the cockpit windscreen, detonating inside. Shrapnel tore through the instrument panel, severing vital control cables and destroying half of Zeamer's essential gauges. A piece of hot metal lodged painfully in Zeamer's right arm. Another fragment sliced his leg. Blood immediately soaked his flight suit, yet he kept both hands firmly on the controls. The cameras were still running. Joe Sarnowski's final duty. In the nose compartment, Joe Sarnowski, the unsung hero, had just finished changing a film magazine, the last major technical task requiring his attention when a Zero launched a direct head-on attack. Sarnowski swung his .50 caliber forward and opened fire. The Zero shuddered and smoked, but its guns raked the B-17's nose before crashing. The ultimate sacrifice. Sarnowski jerked backward, hit multiple times in the abdomen and chest. The injuries were instantly and visibly catastrophic. Sarnowski, the MIT-educated bombardier, knew the physics of his own life had reached its final seconds. Yet, refusing to abandon his post, he grabbed the gun handles, braced himself against the navigator's table, and kept firing. When another Zero swept past, Sarnowski's burst caught it perfectly, sending it spinning into the ocean, his third confirmed kill of the engagement. Protecting the cargo of salvation, he fired one last, desperate burst before collapsing over his gun, instantly unconscious from massive blood loss. Sarnowski had physically fought for several agonizing minutes with fatal wounds, fulfilling his duty to the very end and ensuring that the mission's core intelligence, the film magazines, remained intact and protected beneath his body. Defensive adaptation and crew endurance. In the back, the gunners faced the Zero's tactical shift, attacking from below and ahead, exploiting less armored angles. Waist gunner William Vaughn was hit in the shoulder and head, the world going red and dizzy, but he stayed at his post. Tail gunner Herbert Pugh had been firing almost continuously for 8 minutes, his barrels glowing cherry red, stopping only after confirming his 4th kill. Ammunition belts were running critically low. Britton's courage and Zeamer's foresight. Co-pilot John Britton took shrapnel in both legs. Critically, the extra armor plating Zeamer had installed against regulations absorbed the primary force of the $20 IXT blast, mitigating a potentially fatal injury. Britton looked over at Zeamer, saw him slumped forward, barely conscious, and realized the situation had become exponentially worse. He assumed the controls, despite severe leg wounds, flying on pure determination, collective will, and command. The entire crew became an emergency triage and defensive machine. Radio operator Forrest Dillman grabbed a spare machine gun and fired through an open window. Navigator Ruby Johnston fed ammunition belts and called out enemy positions, despite a fresh wound in his shoulder that he hadn't reported. Evasion and retreat. The photo run was complete. Zeamer, barely lucid, spoke the crucial words, "Photos done. We're getting out of here." He pushed the yoke forward, adding speed to confuse the enemy's targeting. The victory of resistance. But Old 666 refused to die. After 13 minutes of non-stop attack, the Zeros, having lost at least 5 aircraft confirmed destroyed, recognized that the cost of engaging the heavily armed bomber was exceeding the gain. They broke off the attack and turned back toward their bases. The aftermath and damage assessment. The sudden silence was almost worse than the battle, replaced only by the screaming wind through dozens of holes, the drip of hydraulic fluid, and the alarming rattle of the damaged engine number 3. Zeamer tried to take stock. Partial control, sluggish rudder, destroyed instruments, and zero hydraulic pressure. Landing gear and flaps would be a major problem. Flying by determination and shared control. Zeamer, battling to keep consciousness, nodded to Britain. They began a terrible rotation, trading off every 15–20 minutes. Britain held the aircraft steady while Zeamer performed crude battlefield medicine, tying tourniquets with torn flight jacket pieces to stem the massive bleeding. A final act of comfort. In the nose, Ruby Johnston found Sarnowski unconscious, recognizing the mortal wounds. He could only wrap Sarnowski in every available jacket and blanket, a final act of human respect, hoping to delay shock until help arrived. Technical failure and the descent. Engine number 3 finally ceased completely around hours. Old 666 was forced to fly on 3 engines, slowly losing altitude, descending below $15,000 IXT. They were still $300 IXT from Port Moresby, flying a crippled, bleeding aircraft, held aloft by sheer stubbornness and loyalty. The silent vow. Somewhere over the Solomon Sea, bleeding and broken, the crew kept flying toward home. Their motivation was singular: to deliver the priceless intelligence and secure the salvation of the men waiting in the jungle. The final hours and the math of survival. As Old 666 lurched through the sky on its remaining 3 engines, every man was focused on the fragile film magazines in the nose. Their motivation transcended personal pain. It was rooted in the mathematics of strategic survival. They had risked everything to acquire a cargo that was literally life-saving data. Operation Cartwheel and the data imperative. The photographs were the indispensable key to General MacArthur's Operation Cartwheel, the massive strategic plan to isolate the Japanese fortress at Rabaul. This strategy demanded precise, current, and verifiable intelligence on every Japanese asset, airfield locations, supply capacities, naval access points, and safe landing sites across the vast Solomon Islands chain. Guesswork was a luxury they could not afford. Bin and Bougainville, the choke point and intelligence gaps. The area Zeamer photographed was strategically vital, sitting directly across the Japanese supply route leading from Rabaul. Allied planners were paralyzed. Without exact coordinates, runway dimensions, anti-aircraft gun types and arcs, and fuel storage locations, data that only these high-resolution aerial photographs could provide. The mission was crucial to fill a massive intelligence void. The immediate rescue mission: 87 lives. The most immediate and profound impact was the humanitarian crisis. 9 down. Allied air crews, nearly 90 men, were scattered and hiding around Bougainville. The Navy needed to know precisely where it was safe to deploy rescue submarines and buy Catalina flying boats. Zeamer's images were a survival map, detailing Japanese patrol paths and identifying remote, unmonitored beaches suitable for clandestine pickup operations. Instantaneous intelligence analysis. The intelligence effort was monumental. Old 666 touched down, and the film was rushed, immediately for development. The resulting photo quality was extraordinary. Analysts could count individual aircraft at Kahili, trace construction progress on new revetments, chart coastal gun positions, and map patrol boat anchorages. The resulting analysis reports, cross-referenced and annotated, ran to over 200 pages. Morale as a combat multiplier. Beyond the quantifiable strategic value, the mission had a profound impact on morale. By risking a crew to obtain rescue intelligence, the military reinforced a powerful message to every airman facing 30-40 casualty rates: we do not abandon our people. This belief in the system was a vital psychological component, allowing crews to continue climbing into their bombers day after day. The data legacy, the images, cataloged as Intelligence Report 447B, immediately became foundational data for the invasion of New Georgia and the critical Bougainville assault, shaping air raids for the following year. The impossible landing and shared agony. Old 666 staggered back over Port Moresby at the sight of the smoking, low-flying wreck brought every emergency crew onto the runway. Zeamer and Britton, barely conscious, worked together on the manual crank to lower the landing gear for 10 agonizing minutes, sharing the physical burden of their wounds, survival landing, and heroic toll. With minimal hydraulic control and a dangerous landing speed, Zeamer brought the severely damaged bomber down. Medics found 10 men, all wounded. In the nose, they found Joe Sarnowski dead, but still slumped over his gun position. He had fought until his last breath to protect the film, embodying the ultimate commitment to the mission's objective. The rescue consequence. Within 48 hours, based on the clear, current intelligence, rescue operations launched. Coordinated effort saved 87 out of the 90 stranded airmen. The unprecedented awards. The recognition was immediate and unprecedented. Captain Jay Zeamer Jr. received the Medal of Honor. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The Golden Crew. Every remaining crew member received the Distinguished Service Cross DSC. The entire crew received the nation's top 2 awards for valor for a single action, a feat unmatched in Army Air Force's history. A change in doctrine, codifying initiative. The mission fundamentally changed off doctrine. Zeamer's success demonstrated that missions previously deemed suicide could be achieved through individual initiative and unconventional aircraft modification. 5th Air Force Headquarters codified Zeamer's illegal modifications, recommending increased defensive armament for reconnaissance aircraft. Boeing engineers studied old 666's custom features, applying them to later B-17 and B-24 variants. The combat multiplier. Trust. Analysts highlighted the crew cohesion. The crew's success lay not in individual skill ratings, but in unit cohesion. Commanders began prioritizing unit stability over constant rotation, recognizing that trust was the ultimate combat multiplier. The personal legacy and final word. The ripple effect of saving 87 lives extended through generations. Many rescued airmen later named their sons after Joe Sarnowski. Jay Zeamer, who lived until 2007, later summarized the mission: "We just did what needed doing. Other people were depending on those photographs." The history preserved. While old 666 was scrapped, the photographs from June 16, 1943, remain in the National Archives, a permanent, physical testament to the men who bled to protect those images and the men who lived because they were brought home. Triage on the tarmac. The state of the crew. When the medics reached old 666, they weren't faced with survivors. They were faced with casualties. The sheer number of wounds, 10 men, all injured, was staggering. Captain Zeamer was near death from massive blood loss and multiple deep shrapnel wounds to his arm and leg. Co-pilot John Britton, despite his severe leg wounds, was coherent but in deep shock. The gunners presented a grim collection of injuries: shrapnel, broken bones from the aircraft's violent shaking and severe powder burns from firing in confined spaces. The silent hero in the nose. The scene in the nose compartment where Sarnowski lay was heartbreaking. His mortal wounds indicated he had died almost instantly after firing his final, deadly burst. His body had cushioned and protected the crucial K-17 camera magazines, which were utterly undamaged. Medics could do nothing for Sarnowski but pay their silent respects before removing him. The immediate medical challenge: blood loss and infection. The primary medical challenge was not the injuries themselves, but the massive, unchecked blood loss over the 5-hour return flight. Zeamer's condition was critical, requiring immediate blood transfusions upon arrival. The tropical environment also posed an extreme risk of infection from the contaminated metal fragments and shrapnel wounds. This was a battle won in the air, but the fight for life had just begun. On the ground, psychological trauma and adrenaline crash. Beyond the physical, the crew experienced a sudden and total adrenaline crash. The moment the aircraft stopped and the threat vanished, the stored physical and mental energy dissipated. Many men, having fought bravely through their injuries, collapsed into exhaustion, shock, and profound silence. The medics noted the crew's remarkable resilience. They did not panic, even in their worst pain, driven only by the singular goal of mission completion. The forensic examination of the fortress. While the men were rushed to the field hospital, a team of specialized ground crew and off engineers began a forensic examination of Old 666. What they found was a miracle of design and survival. The aircraft had been hit by an estimated 300 to 500 rounds of machine gun fire and at least 10 20mm cannon shells. The triumph of unconventional engineering. The initial report concluded that the aircraft should not have survived. The only reason it did was Zeamer's unconventional armament and illegal modifications. Interlocking firepower. The Zero's favorite rear attack angle was completely nullified by the synchronized fire from the tail, dorsal, and both waist guns. The Zeros ran into a wall of lead. The illegal armor, the added armor plating in the cockpit, which Zeamer had scavenged and installed, proved life-saving for both Zeamer and Britain, absorbing the $20 ext blast that otherwise would have been fatal. Ventral defense success. The supplementary ventral gun, firing straight down, prevented Zeros from completing low-angle passes, forcing the enemy pilots to shift their tactics to predictable, easily targeted vectors. The Boeing and off response. The detailed damage reports and the mission's intelligence success were rushed back to off headquarters and critically shared with Boeing engineers. The findings were revolutionary. Defense wins missions when escort is impossible. Codification. Headquarters officially codified Zeamer's modifications and immediately recommended increased armament for all long-range reconnaissance aircraft in the Pacific Theater. Design influence. Zeamer's focus on eliminating blind spots directly influenced later bomber designs, including B-17G models and modifications to the B-24. His engineering defiance became official doctrine. Recovery and life after war. The physical recovery was long and difficult. Zeamer spent nearly 3 months undergoing multiple surgeries. He received his Medal of Honor in person, a rare honor, but his wounds were too severe for a return to combat. He was grounded, his combat career over. John Britton and the gunners recovered and, remarkably, returned to flight status, forever bound by the event. The living legacy of the rescued. The true legacy of Old 666 lay not just in the medals of honor, but in the 87 men whose lives were saved. The ripple effect of this action was profound. Many of the rescued airmen, now fathers and grandfathers, maintained contact with the surviving crew members. One airman, whose life was saved by the intelligence, later named his son Joseph in honor of Sarnowski's ultimate sacrifice. The mission wasn't just a military victory, it was a demographic miracle. Zeamer's philosophy, the essence of duty. Jay Zeamer, the engineer who became a legend, never sought the spotlight. He remained deeply humble about the Medal of Honor, insisting that Sarnowski deserved the recognition most. He often reiterated his philosophy: duty was paramount. We just did what needed doing, he would say. Other people were depending on those photographs. This quote encapsulated the professional commitment that drove the crew past the point of no return. The historical marker, a permanent testament. While Old 666 was eventually scrapped, the mission's official records, including the Medal of Honor citations, the Intelligence Report 447B, and the detailed damage assessments, are preserved in the National Archives. They serve as a permanent, physical testament to the ultimate combined valor of a small, misfit crew and their Frankenstein fortress, which fundamentally changed aerial warfare doctrine. The stratification of effectiveness. Military analysts dedicated significant post-mission time to understanding why the specific crew, largely composed of men previously marginalized or overlooked, performed better than more decorated, regulation-compliant units. The answer lay in the mission's singular dependence on unit cohesion, the misfit advantage. Zeamer had not selected pilots with the highest efficiency ratings. He chose men who were competent but hungry men who knew what it meant to be disregarded. This shared outsider status fostered a unique, deep-seated loyalty. They flew dozens of mapping missions together before tackling building complex, nonverbal communication and trust. Trust as technology. Analysts concluded that this level of trust was the ultimate combat multiplier. The men of Old 666 knew each other's voices over the roar of the engines, anticipated each other's ammunition needs, and trusted implicitly that everyone would perform their specialized duty even when the aircraft was falling apart. This trust, forged over months of shared adversity, could not be replicated by simply assigning skilled individuals to a crew roster. Change in doctrine, prioritizing stability. The findings influenced off policy throughout the war. Instead of the costly practice of constantly rotating personnel to fill gaps, commanders began actively keeping successful crews together longer, recognizing that unit stability directly translated into higher survival and mission success rates. The lesson of Old 666 was that the human bond was as critical as the hardware. Codifying the illegal modifications. The most immediate and practical legacy was the change in aircraft design doctrine. 5th Air Force Headquarters swiftly moved to codify Zeamer's illegal life-saving modifications. New guidelines were issued for all long-range reconnaissance aircraft, formally recommending the increased defensive armament and armor placement that Zeamer had pioneered. Boeing and the B-17 legacy. The detailed damage assessment of Old 666 and the technical success of its modifications were shared directly with Boeing engineers. Zeamer's focus on eliminating blind spots and reinforcing the nose section directly influenced later production B-17G models and the improved defensive systems of B-24 Liberators. The defiance of a single frustrated engineer became a design standard for thousands of aircraft. Leadership in extremis. Zeamer's decision-making under stress, completing the photo run despite severe wounds, maintaining consciousness, and intelligently trading control with Britain became mandatory reading at pilot training schools. These weren't taught as stories of superhuman endurance, but as illustrations of how leaders make calculated decisions when every option is terrible. Zeamer won by refusing to let the mission fail, and by managing his own incapacitation through leveraging his crew's trust. The ripple effect of salvation. The story continued to resonate most deeply with the families of the 87 rescued airmen. The ripple effects of that single mission extended through generations. Children were born who would not have existed. Businesses were started that would have failed. Many of the rescued airmen stayed in touch with members of the Old 666 crew for the rest of their lives. The honor and humility. Jay Zeamer lived until 2007, often deflecting attention away from his Medal of Honor. He encapsulated the ultimate purpose of the mission with humility. We just did what needed doing. Other people were depending on those photographs. It was a simple statement defining the refusal to abandon duty. The permanent record, though the bomber itself was scrapped for salvage metal in 1944, and no pieces survive in museums, the mission's existence is permanently marked by the highest honors awarded to the crew and, crucially, by the photographs themselves. The images from June 16, 1943, still exist in the National Archives, a physical testament to the men who bled to protect those images and the men who